Hey folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today we're going to be talking about hormonal control, getting into the endocrine system, and we're going to be starting off talking about animals. So, a brief review. Remember when we talked way back in Unit 2 about cell communication and cellular responses to that? We remember we talked about we had a signaling molecule that was going to be released from somewhere, and that signaling molecule would then bind to a receptor that was found in the cellular membrane. That was reception, the first part of cellular communication. Then we have transduction, which is where that signaling receptor is then going to cause a set of changes in some sort of signaling pathway that is eventually going to lead to a cellular response. And we're going to be bringing that back because hormonal control is all about cell communication. There are three kind of major types of cell signaling. The first one is paracrine signaling, and this is where you've got a secreting cell that is going to be affecting some target cells that are local, they're close by. The other one we have is synaptic signaling, which is where an electrical signal is going to be causing neurotransmitters to diffuse across a synapse. We will get into the nervous system more in a later edition. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about the paracrine signaling and then also the hormonal signaling, where you're actually going to have an endocrine cell that is going to release signals into the blood vessels, and then those blood vessels are going to transport the hormones to a different cell that is farther away. So we're going to be focusing mostly on this longer distance signaling, although a little bit of the local signaling as well. So the two systems that deal with signaling are the endocrine system and the nervous system. The endocrine system is more useful in long-term kind of regular, happening in some sort of cycle regulation, whereas the nervous system is good for quick and fast regulation. And again, we're going to be dealing mostly with the endocrine system today, but the two systems really interact and work with one another. They complement one another and help each other to perform their tasks. So again, we've got some different types of signaling that can occur. We've got the endocrine signaling where it kind of gets into the blood vessel, goes somewhere else, initiates a response elsewhere. You've got paracrine signaling where it's local. You've got autocrine signaling where you can actually have cells that affect themselves. And we saw that with stomach cells when we were going through digestion. We've got the synaptic signaling, which is the neurotransmitters across the synapse. We can also have neuroendocrine signaling where where a neurosecretory cell, so this is like a combination of a neuron and an endocrine cell, actually releases chemicals directly into the bloodstream rather than it just being across a synapse. Now, there are two different types of signals or two different kinds of hormones that we're going to be taking a look at. And we've got water-soluble hormones and we've got lipid-soluble hormones. Your water-soluble hormones are able to travel in the blood very easily, right? They can just diffuse into the plasma, and they're going to bind to signal receptors on the membrane of the cell. So these are going to be are not able to cross the lipid bilayer. They're stuck on the outside, so they've got to bind to signal receptors. Whereas your lipid-soluble hormones need some sort of help in terms of being transported in the blood because they don't dissolve into the blood. So what they do is they typically attach to some sort of transport protein to help them out. And then they're actually going to be able to cross that lipid bilayer and therefore be able to affect the cell from within rather than having to go through the cascade pathways on the outside. Now, kind of some of the features of these is that we can either have proteins, amines, or steroids. The proteins and the amines are very similar. The amines are derived from amino acids, whereas the polypeptides are just a protein that would be produced. The steroids are all derived from cholesterol, and they all are going to have this very typical four-ring shape, and they are all lipids. Remember, if you recall back to Unit 1, steroids are a form of a lipid. So again, the two different types have to transport differently. The water-soluble hormones are able to actually move across the cell membranes where they then are going to bind with the signal receptors, where they are either going to be able to initiate some sort of cytoplasmic response or they can invoke some sort of gene regulation. whereas your fat-soluble or lipid-soluble hormones, they must be attached to some sort of transport protein to help them move through the blood to their cell, wherever they're trying to get to. But once they're at the cell, they can actually just diffuse all the way into the nucleus. They will then attach to some sort of signal receptor, and that complex is going to be able to initiate gene regulation. So if we've got a couple, we'll take a look at an example of each. Epinephrine is an example of a protein, and it is going to be attaching to the G protein coupled receptor, which we talked about this before, which is then going to initiate a G protein to bind with adenyl cyclase, which is then going to promote ATP to turn into cAMP, which is a secondary messenger. So remember, epinephrine is the primary messenger, the cAMP is the secondary messenger, which is then going to initiate protein kinase A, which is then going to eventually lead to the inhibition of glycogen synthesis and the promotion of glycogen breakdown, which is going to produce energy. And that's good because epinephrine is going to be helping with your fight or flight response. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail later on. In contrast, we've got a hormone estradiol, which is going to be able to move across the plasma membrane. It is going to bind with its receptor, and that hormone receptor complex is able to move directly to the DNA. It is then going to produce the mRNA for vitellogenin, which is then going to produce the protein vitellogenin, and this is very important in terms of regulating the menstrual cycle, which again we'll talk about in a little more detail later on. So we're going to be taking a closer look at the mammalian endocrine system, kind of working through some of the different glands that are involved. Some overall things is we're going to see a lot of negative feedback. That is kind of one of the things you see a lot of in the endocrine system. There's a little bit of positive feedback, and we'll take a look at one of those examples as well. And the other thing is that we generally have these kind of antagonistic hormone pairs. So, one of the hormones promotes something, whereas the other one inhibits it. And through the two of them working together, you're able to maintain homeostasis. There are lots of endocrine glands. We're not going to take a look at all of them. We're just going to kind of hit the major ones. And some organs from other systems also have endocrine cells integrated within them. Think of something like the stomach, right? The stomach was able to, both secrete hormonal signals while also performing its digestive function. All right, so the brain endocrine glands, there are three of them, the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. We're just going to take a look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You'll notice that the two of them are very close to one another. In fact, they are pretty much a part of the exact same complex. And they're all very tightly integrated with the nervous system, since the brain is what controls both the endocrine and the nervous systems. So the hypothalamus, we'll take a look at two examples. The first one is a positive feedback mechanism. So here we've got a stimulus, which is such as a baby suckling, and what that's going to do is it's going to cause the hypothalamus to release hormones, which that hormone is oxytocin, and then that oxytocin is able to go into the blood vessels, reach the smooth muscle in the breast, which is then going to cause milk release. That milk release is then going to cause more suckling, and so on and so forth. You can see how that's going to be a positive feedback mechanism. Another place where we see the hypothalamus being involved is when you get cold. So when you're cold, your hypothalamus is going to be stimulated to secrete thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. That TRH is then going to be sent over to the pituitary gland, which is going to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH is then going to go through blood vessels to go to your thyroid gland, which is going to secrete T3 and T4. Those are then going to your body tissues, and this is going to increase cellular metabolism. Now, why would that be a good thing? Well, if you're cold, right, you want to increase the amount of heat that is generated within your body. Where is most of your body heat in your body generated? Through cellular metabolism. So we can increase that process, those processes, and we can increase the amount of heat formed. And you can see that there are a couple of mechanisms that can shut off what's going on in front of it. So TSH, increased levels of increased levels of T3 and T4 reduce the amount of TSH and TRH that are being produced. All right, so the pituitary is the master gland. Again, it is really integrated with the hypothalamus, and it makes control hormones for many of the other cells, other glands, which is why it's called a master gland. It is integrated with the hypothalamus, and it has two lobes that make different hormones. However, all of them are peptides. And so here's just kind of, you can see some of the different ones produced by the posterior and the anterior end. The posterior end produces ADH and oxytocin. We already talked about oxytocin. ADH, remember, is anti-diuretic hormone, which we talked about when we talked about the excretory system. It helps to regulate our osmolarity within ourselves. And then from the from the anterior pituitary, we've got FSH and LH, which are going to be targeting either the testes or the ovaries. We'll talk about them later. We've got TSH, which is what is stimulating the thyroids. You've got ACTH, which is going to be stimulating your adrenal cortex. Prolactin is going to stimulate milk production in the mammary glands. MSH is going to be increasing your melanocytes, or your sleeping, right? And then GH is going to be affecting your liver, bones, and some other tissues as well. So it has a lot of different hormones that affect a lot of different things. All right, the thyroid is in your neck. It is kind of wrapped around the trachea from the front, kind of going towards the back. And it helps to regulate metabolism as well. And, again, it has that T3 and T4 that is produced when it is stimulated by TSH. It also is very important that you get enough iodine for it to function properly. You can get a goiter, which is an enlarging of the thyroid if you do not have enough iodine in your diet. I tried to get a picture, but for some reason I couldn't get one to go in there. But essentially, you can imagine your neck swelling up because your thyroid gland enlarges. And if you want to Google it, you can find, just be warned, they are kind of weird looking. All right, then you got the parathyroid. The parathyroid is kind of on the back of the thyroid gland, so it's attached to the thyroid, but it's on the back. So the thyroid wraps around here. Parathyroid is on the back. It produces PTH, which is going to regulate Ca or calcium ions in your blood. And this is very important because if you recall back to when we were doing cell communication, if you remember, calcium ions are a very important secondary messenger, and they are used in a lot of different transduction pathways. So it's very important that we regulate the amount of it that we have in our blood, so that way all the cells have as much as they need. So what PTH does is it stimulates calcium uptake in the kidneys, so basically you retaining calcium in your kidneys. That also is then going to increase calcium uptake in your intestines, and then it also releases calcium from your bones. So your bones actually aren't static. They kind of, if you've got excess calcium, you store it in your bones, and then when you need it back, you can take it back out, which I think is kind of interesting. Most of us kind of think of bones as being static and not changing, but they are useful, and they do things in helping you maintain your life. And then once blood levels rise, that is going to then decrease the amount of PTH that is produced. All right, we've talked about the pancreas before. The pancreas is going to be, helping to regulate blood glucose levels through the insulin glucagon. There's our antagonistic pairs that we were kind of talking about. I'm not going to go over this super much, other than to say that this is considered an endocrine system function. All right, we've also got the adrenal glands, which are located on top of the kidneys. These are releasing our stress hormones, and we've got two different types of stress hormones. We've got short-term, which is your fight or flight ones. You've got epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those are released from the adrenal glands. And then you've got the long-term ones, which are corticoids, which are steroids. And this is an important point. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are both proteins, and notice that they're used for short-term things, whereas the corticoids, which are a type of steroid, are much more long-term. And so this is something that we in general see is that things that are proteins or the amines, those hormones tend to be for very short-term effects, whereas your long-term effects tend to come about through your steroids. however they may be. All right, and then you've got your sex glands, which are super important for proper sexual development and gamete production. We've got your ovary and your testes, which we will get into today, and then you've got the placenta and the uterus when you're pregnant, and we will talk about those when we get to reproduction. So the ovary is very important in regulating the menstrual cycle, which is, obviously very important for proper reproduction to occur. It is regulated by 4 major hormones. 2 are produced by the pituitary, FS and LH. FS is follicle stimulating hormone, and then you've got LH, which is luteinizing hormone. And together they trigger the development and the release of a mature ovum or an egg. And then you've got estrogen and progesterone, which are produced by the ovary itself, and they're involved in the development and maintenance of the uterine lining, also known as the endometrium. Let's kind of take a look. So I'm sorry, it's FSH, not just FS. So what happens is that you've got the hypothalamus, which is being inhibited by estradiol and progesterone, and then is stimulated by high levels of estradiol. And so once estradiol gets increased, the hypothalamus produces GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH, and it is inhibited by low levels of estradiol. So when estradiol increases, that then is going to produce FSH and LH, or allow FSH and LH to be produced. Now, what FSH and LH do is that they are going to take a follicle and they're going to push it towards maturation, and then a signal an increase in LH. So as LH surges, that is going to cause the release of the ovum into the reproductive system. And we'll talk all about that stuff when we get into the reproductive system. And then you notice that FSH and LH levels will then fall back down after the ovum is released. Now, at the same time, what's happening is that the ovary is releasing estradiol and progesterone. So notice that the estradiol values peak a little bit before LH values peak, which is important because that is what is allowing the pituitary gland to actually produce the LH. Progesterone is also being produced at this time, and you notice that progesterone and estradiol, they will begin to increase, and what that's going to do is it's going to promote a thickening of the endometrium, that uterine lining, so that way, if the egg is fertilized, it is then going to implant in the endometrium. Now, if there is no implantation, that then is going to fall off. The progesterone and the estradiol fall off, and therefore the levels of the lining of the uterus will then flow, and that's what happens when a female is on her period, is that the progesterone and the estradiol has fallen off. Now the endometrial lining is going to be falling off and leaving the body. Now, if implantation occurs, the egg itself will produce hormones that will tell the endometrium to stick around and stay for a longer period of time. And again, we'll get into that when we get into reproduction. All right, the testes are also important, although it's not happening on a cycle, it's happening all the time. Both FSH and LH are involved, and they're both produced by the pituitary gland, and they are then going to be signaling to the testes to go through a set of sequences that are going to lead to the production of sperm. So, thanks for watching. Hope you all are staying safe and staying warm, and I'll see you next time.